Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to another episode from the ORC, where we'll leave that in. Right. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Another screw up from me on the introduction. Over to you, Ian. Sorry, I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G. And this is the ORC. That almost rhymes, but let's not start rapping. So today we're going to talk about the B17. Why? Well, because as we know, the Masters of the Air Apple TV show has landed in the UK and other parts of the world. It's caused a bit of a splash, certainly among certain communities of people who are interested in World War II, the Second World War, and aviation and drama and good TV. So as other podcasts and Twitter groups have taken to the airwaves discussing it and analysing it, we're not going to analyse the TV programme, but we're going to use it as an excuse to talk about the B-17 and lots of little what-ifs. Rather than a big strategic what-if in history, we're going to talk about lots of little things that could have happened around the B-17 or its alternative or its alternatives, not necessarily at a strategic level. We're not talking about why the Allies chose to do aerial bombing or strategic bombing. We won't dwell too much on that, but we're going to talk about a slightly lower level than that. So that's it. Today, the B-17, as I've discovered, apparently, you get certain advertising possibilities if you see certain products quite a lot. So we're going to see Masters of the Air quite a lot. See it.
Masters of the Air.
Yeah, if they want to advertise on our podcast, you're more than welcome. Apple TV Masters of the Air. But anyway,
I kept thinking of Masters of the Universe, but it's Masters of the Air. Masters of the Air.
Based on a book.
Just before we start, just a quickie. We've been looking at our analytics for our podcast, and we don't get much in terms of knowing what's going on. But we have found that we have at least one listener from Quebec in Canada. So bonjour. Hopefully my accent's not too bad. Hopefully you're enjoying the podcast, and if you want to provide any feedback, hopefully you know where the Twitter page is. Just wanted to get that in.
Yeah, ORC_time, or of course Merci as well. Of course, you could be in Quebec and be an English speaker who's moved there, but I'm sure you're fairly bilingual anyway. So thanks for listening anyway.
Right. Okay. So as Ian says, we're not necessarily talking about Masters of the Air, not Masters of the Air at least. We're talking about the B-17. So, quick question for you then, Ian. With the B-17, it's classed as a heavy bomber, but the bomb payload is 4,000 pounds. So when I was just looking at some of the googly options in preparation for this podcast, when I look at the Wellington was the one is always my first choice because my dad used to work on them after the war when he got called up. And the Wellington bomber is classed as a medium bomber, but can actually carry more bombs. So its payload was higher. It was 4,500 pounds. So how do they classify these aircraft? Because, to me, it seems a bit weird that it's not necessarily based on the payload. Is it on the total weight of the aircraft, for example?
Well, like most things military, there's seldom hard and fast rules. So a medium bomber is really a bomber that's used in a medium way, which basically means it's got a modest payload. It's got a modest range. And it's used in a tactical theatre, not necessarily tactically in terms of attacking frontline troops, but it's used in a war theatre in the Second World War. By that I mean not necessarily from the UK. So we're talking medium years of the war, for example, in the Mediterranean and in Burma. Yes, the Wellington was used heavily there. B-25s, B-26s a bit later. There was usage of the American B-24 in both Mediterranean and Burma, but it's certainly British heavy bombers like the Stirling, the Halifax, and the Lancaster, despite the odd dodgy film, wouldn't have been used weren't used in the Mediterranean, weren't used in the Far East, because they were focused around strategic heavy bombing based in the UK, and that's where the B-17 fitted in as well. So the heavy bomber is generally a 4-engine bomber, medium bomber, 2-engine with a lower range, but the payload itself may not be that different, certainly in the American case.
Yeah, so which is fair, because the range is roughly this. It isn't that much different. The B-17's got a larger range, but not by a huge amount. the ceiling that it can fly at is much different. I mean, there's no doubt
Much
about
different.
that.
Sorry, much different from
The Wellington. So the Wellington
right. Okay.
was like 20,000 feet, and the B17's what 30 something.
I think that was true. I think that
something.
was true of the B17 and the Lancaster. But the Lancasters would carry significantly higher payload, but not as high.
I think it could actually.
Well, okay, all right. Well, those of you with access to Google can check that. But the interesting thing is that certainly the British were quite keen. They again, there was no dogma as such, but they stuck to the medium tactical sense. The Lancaster and its equivalent, the Halifax. The Stirling was the first 4-engine bomber, but wasn't massively successful and quite vulnerable. Used throughout the war as various other purposes, towing gliders and such like, but again, didn't deploy to the Mediterranean.
So let's talk about the B-17 then. So Flying Fortress, and the Fortress bit comes from the large number of machine guns, which I'm assuming it comes from the large number of machine guns that are part of the aircraft infrastructure, more than any other plane during the Second World War, as far as I'm aware. Don't know about the B-29, whether that had 10, a crew of 10 and 7 stations.
Let's not go for massive tangent, but the B-29 was quite sophisticated in the sense of its gun turrets were remotely controlled, so there wasn't a crewman actually in the turret. They were essentially controlled from within a section of the fuselage near the, because the B-29 was pressurized, so it would be quite difficult to crew a pressurized plane with staff personnel actually in the turret. So it was all remotely controlled via periscopes and what have you and the rest of it. So a very sophisticated aircraft. So
back to the B-17 then, Flying Fortress, lots of machine guns, and obviously when you have lots of machine guns, you have to have lots of machine gun bullets, which if you want to fire lots of bullets means you've got to carry lots of ammunition, which I'm assuming is one of the reasons that the payload or the bomb payload of a B-17 is relatively low in comparison to its contemporaries in the RAF.
Yeah, and you've obviously got the gunners themselves, who are big strapping American lads of 100 and something pounds, 70, 80 kilos. The machine guns themselves, you've got a variety of 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns. The 50 caliber machine gun in particular is a very heavy machine gun. It's still used today. You see it on top of tanks and stuff. It's the big machine gun you see on top of tanks or armored vehicles, used in all Western armies, NATO armies to this day, pretty much unmodified. So those weapons are heavy. As you say, you're carrying all that ammunition. You're carrying extra crewmen. You've got, in comparison to Lancaster, you've got an extra 3 crewmen. So that's a weight of bombs that you cannot carry because you're carrying heavy machine guns, heavy caliber bullets, or certainly in the 50 caliber sense, it's a heavy caliber bullets, and you've got heavy crewmen with all their gear as well. Those of you have seen Masters of the Air from Apple, great big thick clothing to protect them from the freezing cold temperatures. All that all adds up, and they've obviously all got parachutes, and they've all got their own personal kit. It all adds up. So it's a question of, do I go for weight versus defence? And it's a balance. I mean, the B-17 didn't always have all that defensive armament. The later versions, certainly the G model later in the war, had a chin turret, because again, those of you who've seen Masters of the Air, and those who've seen many other programs or have read about the B-17, the Germans would attack it from the front because it was very vulnerable from the front, because it's got a rear gunner, it's got side gunners, it's got an upper turret gunner, but it didn't have, on the early models, a turret on the front. So they put in a chin turret, which does what it says on the tin, underneath the front of the front of the aircraft. Again, that was a significant weight, but again, it was defensive. The early versions didn't have that. The even earlier versions, bearing in mind the B-17 was developed in the 30s, unlike its Lancaster equivalent, which was developed during the actual Second World War. It didn't have defensive armament in the same places. It didn't have a rear gun until during the war. So it certainly had a rear firing machine gun when it was deployed, but when it was first developed in late 1930s, it didn't. It had glazed panels rather than. Sorry, somebody's just come in the room. let me just say, rather something about the co-op, but never mind.
Well, we live in the real world here, Ian,
And I've lost my train. I've lost my train of thought. So it developed over a period of time, but it got heavier. It just got heavier.
Yeah. So it's funny when you look at the actual characteristics. I'm looking at the differences between the Lancaster and the B17, and they're very close. It's quite strange that they're roughly the same size. Their gross weight isn't that much different, but one carries almost 3 times as many bombs as the other one.
Yeah, and also the actual bomb bay itself was 3 times as long as well. Again, do the math. Yeah, if the bomb bay wasn't accessible from within the Lancaster by the crew, it ran more or less from underneath where the pilot sat all the way back to where the mid-upper gunner sat, but it wasn't accessible. So that means that as bombs themselves, so even if they weren't heavy, but if it didn't get heavier over development periods, if they got developed into a different shape which would penetrate concrete or penetrate the reverse of penetrating concrete was the blockbuster, which had a very thin skin on the bomb, so massive blast effect. So you weren't actually penetrating into the ground, you were just blasting buildings from surface level. The B-17 couldn't carry those weapons because they wouldn't. I mean, even if it could lift them, which it probably could,
yeah, they couldn't fit in the bomb bay.
They wouldn't fit. So
they're
again,
almost like single purpose from that perspective.
Yes, the Americans didn't, notoriously or otherwise, certainly in Europe, didn't develop their actual weapons in terms of the bombs they dropped hardly at all because they couldn't fit them in the vehicles they designed to carry them.
I actually don't know whether the strategy of having heavily armored bombers was a practical approach in terms of its defence. When you consider how many got shot down versus other planes that don't have that level of defence and whether they would have been shot down even more. Was it worth it? Is in the
well, the short answer is no, they weren't, because ultimately they were saved, inverted commas, by the development of long-range fighter escorts.
So the P-51.
Yeah, and to a lesser degree the P-47, which with drop tanks, but certainly the P-51 could go anywhere they could go.
I didn't realise the P-51 was a requirement of the RAF that was met by.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Thank you, RAF. Yeah.
Indeed, and then ultimately made into a successful aircraft by the adoption of the Merlin engine, albeit made in its thousands through the fantastic economy of the United States.
Well, it does. That's one of the questions, and it's a what if type thing. Is why didn't the Americans build British design bombers? I mean, other than they just didn't want to. They could have. The most obvious one they could have done, or on paper,
was the Mosquito. I mean, we've talked about how the B-17 could carry approximately 4,000 pounds of bombs to Berlin and back. So could the de Havilland Mosquito, and that was a two-engined, two crewmen, pilot and navigator aircraft. An incredible aircraft of the Second World War. Arguably the most flexible aircraft was a fighter bomber, a bomber, a reconnaissance aircraft, photo reconnaissance, maritime strike, night fighter. I've probably missed out a couple of specialist transport.
You name it, could do it. I mean, it was even fast. Wasn't it faster than the Spitfire and the equivalent?
Certainly when it was first developed, but like all planes, it got heavier and heavier as they put more kit in it. But despite the Spitfire got more powerful as it developed. But yeah, so when it was first developed, it could. So the what if is, why couldn't the Americans have said, well, instead of sending 10 men in a B-17 to drop 4,000 pounds of bombs, why don't we send
two? It was two.
Yeah. Why didn't we send a Mosquito that those 10 men could go in 5 Mosquitoes, albeit all right, they're doing different roles, and one has to be a pilot in each aircraft, and a bomber gunner is not as well educated as the pilot and trained and all the rest of it, so it doesn't become a pilot. Why didn't they do that? Why couldn't they have built the Mosquito? Well, they got to look at as many people who listen to this pod may know, the Mosquito was made from wood. Not completely made from wood, but its major components are made from wood. It was made famously in bits and then brought together. So all the piano factories in the UK stopped making pianos. They didn't all make Mosquitoes, but many of them made parts of Mosquitoes, which were then shipped to factories and all joined together. There was a large amount of plywood manufacturers who were gluing plywood together to make furniture. They were told to stop doing that, and they were making bits of the Mosquito. So it was the interesting thing about the Second World War in terms of or one of the interesting things in terms of economies is Britain's economy. Yes, it turned into a wartime economy, but it was what you might describe as an artisan economy. So rather than making pianos, we started making mosquitoes. And yes, we made an awful lot of mosquitoes, but it wasn't made in a huge factory.
Well, no,
so
but
it wasn't wood going at one end and the mosquito coming out of the other. Whereas
That's right.
in America, when they were building the B17 and everything else comes to that, Sherman tanks and all the rest of it, they were taking raw materials at one end of the factory, and out the end was coming a B17. So
but in the scenario of a what if, the issue is, okay, so say they thought, well, and I'm not saying taking 10 men and making them fly 5 planes. I mean, even if you said there were, because not everybody's a pilot, that's one of the things. But I mean, you could triple the amount of bombs that you could be delivering. And let's face it, the just as an alternative, the Mosquito could actually fight against the fighters that were trying to shoot them down.
Well,
after there's no doubt that's after they dropped the bombs, they would have been a capable,
yes, it could,
competent opponent.
You're right. So not only could you have let's say that you assume that you dropped the same bomb load, but you could potentially have dropped more bombs. But even if you dropped the same bomb load, you would have lost less aircraft. But one of the what ifs, or the thing that goes along with any what if, is how would the Mosquito? The Mosquito was a great plane, and it did fantastic. It did bomb Berlin, the RAF Light Striking Force. It bombed many German towns as nuisance raids or diversion raids. Had it been flying in daytime, because that's what it was replacing. If no,
that's right. Yeah.
Had it been flying in daytime, and it did fly in daytime. Don't get me wrong, it flew tactically in daytime, both as a maritime strike against particularly ships in Norwegian waters, and also it did attack submarines and stuff on the surface, and it did attack tactical targets in Normandy and Northwest Europe, bridges and that stuff. But had it been flying strategically to Berlin, would it have been seen as a great aircraft? Who knows? Because the Germans would have attacked it in the same way they attacked B-17s, and there would have been huge melees of fighters attacking Mosquitoes or ME-109s and FW-190s. Would the Mosquito have been able to fly day in, day out in daylight over Germany in ranks of hundreds? It was doing that as photo reconnaissance. That was one plane at incredible altitude with virtually nothing aboard apart from the cameras, so it would go very fast and very high. If it was carrying bombs and defensive,
there's another sort of option that you could have, is that they could actually have been fighter escorts.
Indeed,
and they were without bombs, so
Indeed.
their range is pretty similar. So they
correct. But notoriously, the RAF never developed a fighter escort.
No, I agree. And we are talking about a what if, and we're talking about the Americans. If they'd have recognised the potential.
Well, the Americans did fly the Mosquito in some roles, not in terms of I don't know the exact numbers, but the photo reconnaissance, and they looked like American aircraft. They were painted with the stars and bars and their camouflage scheme, so they were aware of its capabilities. Is the thing about taking one aircraft and saying this was really good in this role, why didn't you use another role? Well, because the reason it's very good in that role, because it's very good in that role. I mean, the thing to remember about the bomber version of the Mosquito is it didn't actually have any defensive armament. So the fighter bomber version couldn't carry as many the same weight of bomb as the pure bomber version that was used during night. So
no, I mean there's a trade-off, but but you could
So what would it have done? So if you deploy the bomber version in daylight over Berlin, it's defenseless other than its speed. Well, it's
but
not
then
actually.
The armor that you need is only for the 2 people in the cockpit, not necessarily for the 10 other people.
That's protection. The bomber version had no cannons or machine guns, so it had no means of fighting back. So so if you deploy the fighter bomber version, which had a combination of cannons, machine guns, and bombs, you're carrying less bombs. So it's.
But if you've got more planes. Overall benefit is that you're dropping more ordnance. But anyway, okay, so we've talked about the Mosquito. I think we're both big fans of the Mosquito, and it probably, it was a brilliant plane it's not as well publicised as other aircraft in the Second World War. So let's move on from the Mosquito and say, well, why didn't the Americans build Lancasters? I mean, let's face it, it's a heavy bomber. it had machine gunners, all right, it didn't have as many. But if we're saying that the B-17 wasn't, as the Flying Fortress bit didn't work as well as they'd hoped. I mean, there's no doubt they thought it would be a massive protective solution, having all of that covering machine gun capability. They would have had something similar with a Lancaster.
The obvious answer to that is the Americans wanted to do strategic daylight bombing, the so-called.
Yeah, but why couldn't you use Lancasters to do that?
Well, the Lancaster had been used when it first developed from the Manchester bomber, which looks very similar, except it's got 2 engines rather than 4. Had terrible engines. The Rolls-Royce Vulture, absolute rubbish engines. Replaced with the Merlin, very capable aircraft, but it couldn't defend itself in daytime. They tried think of a famous German manufacturer, the MAN diesel plant. There was a raid by Lancasters to the MAN diesel plant. I think it was 12 aircraft. 6 got shot down, 6 got back. They didn't until the end of the war, when there was air supremacy and there was a very little chance of being attacked. The Lancaster could not defend itself with its 303 rifle caliber machine guns during daylight. It was as fast as the B-17, but it could have been developed. It could have been developed. So
well, yeah, I mean, don't forget, we're talking about a plane that can carry 3 times the amount of bombs. So say you only doubled the amount of bombs to increase the performance of the machine guns.
But then that's not, so you would take up the 303s and put in 50 calibers, or at some point there was 20 millimeter cannons were talked about. But again, by the time, as you say, you're putting in 20 millimeter cannons for defense of 50 caliber machine guns, and you're taking the bombs out, and then you've got a 1.5 times a B-17.
Well, twice that. I mean, you could have twice. Don't forget, you're still only having a crew of 7. You're not got a crew of 10.
Yeah, but you would need extra crew because you're putting in extra defensive armament. Your rear turret and mid-upper turret, and in the Lancaster, the bomb aimer would fire the front turret in extremis, which to a certain extent it was true of the B-17 as well. But so you would need potentially side ventral gun positions, i.e. the side.
No, but why would you?
Well, because because it had no defense it would have no defense from certain angles. It didn't have a ball turret. It had no defense from below.
Right, so it would be a slightly different strategy in that, there would be machine gun coverage, but
you have to put that weight in of machine guns and somebody to fire them. But I accept your point. There would still be an advantage over the B-17. So you could make the Lancaster as defendable as a B-17, and it would probably carry more bombs. But would it be a strategic difference? And then how long does it take you to gear up a factory in a different part of the world to produce that? They did make them in Canada. I mean, somebody no doubt is shouting at the pod. Hopefully,
hopefully the guy from Quebec or the person from
Quebec. Indeed, I can't remember how the proportion, but an awful lot of Lancasters were built in Canada. There's only 2 Lancasters flying today. One's flying with the RAF, and the other one's flying for the Royal Canadian Air Force memorial flight, and that's in Canada, obviously, and that was built in Canada. So you can, in theory, but again, like a lot of these things, it's technically quite difficult. And obviously, the other side is, never forget chauvinism, because it works in both ways. The Americans wouldn't want to build a British bomber anymore.
Well, no, I mean that's pretty certain. Yeah.
Any more than Britain would want to build an American bomber. Although, albeit they would sell them or lend them through Lend-Lease.
Well, I mean, you can say, I mean, we were more amenable to it, I suppose. You only have to look at the P-51, for.
Yeah, but those were bought. They or lended. They weren't built in Britain.
But they were built because
they were specified.
The RAF,
the specifications.
Asked for them. The US Army Air Force didn't ask for them. It was
but then because the US Army Air Force at that point wasn't in a shooting war. So even if individuals could identify a requirement, there wasn't any money forthcoming.
But if the RAF if the UK hadn't asked for those fighters and the Americans had waited, the P-51 would have been that much later coming into the.
Well, indeed, the war would have,
a lot more B-17s would have been shot down.
Indeed, and that's true of many things. I mean, the Sherman tank, which was
it's in Masters of the Air quite often. Yeah.
The Sherman tank was based on a chassis of the Grant tank, which was used by the British, or specified and improved by the British, and then it got as far as it wanted, and then it could go, and then there was other examples of that. War drives change, but if you're not in that war, even if you're intellectually interested in developing things, if you're not in the war, nobody's going to pay for them. So
coming back to not Masters of the Air, even though we want to mention Masters of the Air, one of the things that just occurred to me with the Lancasters doing, or Bomber Command doing night bombing, with the gunners, how do they see the fighters at night? I mean, there were German night fighters, but there probably weren't as many German night fighters trying to shoot down.
No, and there were
bombers, because they're going to be struggling, aren't they, to see what the hell's in front of them at 300 miles an hour?
Well, they're using radar, remember? So the
was that at the start of the war? I don't know when the.
Well, so there's arguably there's three phases. There's three phases. The start of the war, nobody was shooting down anything at night because, as you say, nobody could say anything. The middle part of the war, in terms of the strategic night, and this applied to the Blitz on Britain as well. Is the development of radar guided night fighters. So, I mean, I'm being general here. So yes, there were Hurricanes that would, in the UK, that would fly, into the night and go and try and attack things based on what they could see in the searchlights or the glow of the fires below. And there were other aircraft such as the Bolton Paul Defiant, which was a slightly odd-looking plane with a turret on the back. And the Germans are equivalent, but the night fighter with radar, both in the UK and in Germany, was deployed around 1941-42, and they would be on their own. So they would be given a track from a ground controller saying there's a intruder in this area. They would fly into that area. They would switch on their own radar, relatively unsophisticated, and try and find it. And then when they got relatively close to the target, they would see the glow of the exhausts from the plane. Sometimes they would feel the turbulence of its wake, inverted commas. Sometimes they would see the silhouette against the background. But to answer your question is, how did the gunners on a Lancaster see the target or the incoming target? The answer is they didn't, and that's why so many were shot down.
That's probably one of the reasons why they only have those rifle bullet machine guns.
Well, indeed, to a certain extent, yes, that's certainly true. That said, having a heavy, plenty of night fighters were shot down, but more were damaged and returned to base. Those ones damaged wouldn't have been damaged if hit by a 50 caliber or a 20mm cannon. They'd have been shot down.
I've never seen a night fighter radar screen. It makes you wonder what it looks like. I doubt if it's anything like what you see on the TV for modern.
It certainly isn't the rotating. It's not the rotating thing that we're all familiar with from dodgy films. It's generally an oscilloscope type thing you can think from school, where it's a line with
a straight line and then
with a wave
in it.
Indeed, that's what you see. So again, the B17 could have been developed into a night bomber. It almost did. Had the P51 not come along, or to a certain extent, had there not been a gap in the bombing of Europe, because the B-17s were used in the Mediterranean for a month or two, and they came back and there was many more available from America and crews and the rest of it, and they tried it again and it still wasn't great until the P-51 came along. There was definitely and there was some American B-17s used in night raids, but again they would have had to convert the entire force to a night force. Yes, they would have saved. They wouldn't have carried as many gunners, but the navigators would have to be retrained. Some of the kit in the aircraft would have to be installed. There's a couple of British navigation devices called G and Oboe, which essentially are beams. Are a narrow beam is sent across the troposphere, and you're trying to intersect with it, and when you intersect with more than one, you have a rough idea where you are, etc.
Well, that's supposed to be X marks the spot, isn't it, where the two beams cross?
Yeah, B-17s didn't carry that. They did carry HS2, which was a downward looking radar.
Oh, not a train.
No. Although the Americans called it HSX for reasons best known to themselves, but that was a British invention that they carried on B-17s, which the Lancaster had near the end of the war. And the third phase of the night war was where the Germans were getting semi-desperate to a certain extent. Yes, they had night fighters and radar. They were sending up single-engined aircraft ME-109s and the so-called wild, it's in German, I can't really say it, but it's wild sow raids where they were using the glow of searchlights, the glow of the fires on the ground, the tumbling Lancasters which are on fire getting shot down as a beacon saying, just come over here and start firing at things. And but that was a sort of a certain desperation, because again, if you put B-17s flying at night, one of the advantages in flying in the day is that the German workers don't get any sleep because they're in their shelters in the day because of the American Air Force.
Oh yeah,
and they're in their shelters at night, and that's true of the gun crews, the fighter pilots, everybody.
Yeah, so it was non-stop. I mean, ultimately, was
although the targets didn't always the targets didn't always attack the same targets very often, because they're completely different set of targets, because they had different strategies based on their ability to hit the target.
So coming back to Masters of the Air, then just something that on one of the episodes that I don't know whether you know the answer to this. So how many actual bombs did they carry?
I don't know. I mean, certainly in the Lancaster, it varied depending on the raid. So the all-up weight would be the same, but the combination of incendiaries and
are they? They're not 500-pound bombs.
I think the Americans were wedded to the 500-pound bomb, which is one of the criticisms, because the 500-pound bomb was a general purpose bomb.
So I mean, just being picky on the TV program, then there's a scene where they show you the bombs, the B-17s dropping bombs, and if it's 4,000 pounds and they're 500 pound each, they drop a lot more than 8 bombs.
They could have been
24 bombs,
but
something.
They could have been incendiaries.
Yeah, but all of the bombers were dropping in the scene. They all drop like about 20 bombs, and they show them exploding on the ground. They're definitely not incendiaries.
Maybe that's one for our Fighting on Film contemporaries, another podcast that is worth a listen. Give a shout out to those guys.
I mean, we're talking 8 to 10 bombs.
Yeah.
No, it was just one of those things that I was watching, and I was thinking that seems to be a hell of a lot of bombs that are coming out of the planes. Whereas when you see the guys walking past and then arming the bombs, there's not that many.
No, but whether they show the whole length of the bomb bay, or they don't really call it a bomb bay in the B-17, but whether because it isn't a bay as such, but whether they show them walking the whole length.
The bombs are behind the pilot and the mid-turret gunner, aren't they?
Yeah,
the waist gunners are in the middle of the plane, and there's no bombs beyond them to the rear of the plane.
No.
So, yeah.
I mean, just going back to one of the what ifs around the B-17. I mean, the question is why did they persevere with the B-17 when they had the B-29? And the B-29 was people think that the Manhattan Project was the most expensive project in America of World War II or the Second World War. It wasn't. The B-29 bomber was the most expensive single project, certainly in the American side. It's difficult to gauge what the Germans spent on various things, but because obviously they had slave labour and all the rest of it, so the calculation is different. But the B-29 4-engine pressurised bomber, remote controlled.
But when did that come into service?
That came into service in early 1944. So there was another 18 months of bombing of Germany at that point. I mean, in terms of numbers. But a single.
What was the scenario in Europe at that particular time then?
Well, the scenario in Europe was the lead up to D-Day, so that was the bombing of the attempt to get the German Air Force up into the air so it could be shot down to get air superiority, and then the bombing of strategic targets in France, of bridges and railway marching yards to stop any.
But then I suppose you could say then that the B-17 was still okay. He's got P-51.
But
protection and all this type of stuff. So.
Indeed, but why? If you're producing hundreds of B-29s, why only deploy them to the Pacific or Far East? Why wasn't it used?
I don't know how many were produced at what time though. I mean, they only came into service.
There were certainly hundreds.
44.
There were certainly multiple hundreds of B-29s in the Far East in late 1944, and the American Army Air Force was still bombing day in, day out. European targets, principally in Germany by that point, obviously.
So what was their bomb payload? Out of interest,
I couldn't tell you. I'm afraid I don't know. But its range was I guess maybe it's because of his range. Its range was its major factor, because obviously with the war in the Pacific, you needed to attack these islands to build runways then to enable for the B-29s. It was nowhere particularly close to Japan, and they were bombed from China as well, mainland China, at some part of the war. But then there was a variety of reasons why they stopped doing that. The Japanese attacked, and there was some storms and hurricanes and stuff that wrecked some of the airfields as well. So they left China.
20,000. So it was a bit more than the Lancaster, 20,000.
There you go. It's 4 or 5 times the payload of the B-17. You know, so it's. I mean, again, a major what ifs. People always say what. Well, people don't always say this. People aren't stopping you in the street saying this.
Well, not yet, anyway. When you're famous. Yeah.
But sometimes people people speculate what would have happened if D-Day had failed. Well, what would happen if D-Day failed was the B-29s would have been deployed to Europe, bombed the SH-1T out of Germany, and then ultimately dropped an atomic bomb in Berlin. That's what would have happened if D-Day had failed. You know, the war would have lasted another year, and millions of people would have died. You know, I'm not suggesting it's an easy solution, but no, it's an odd one. I mean, somebody somewhere knows why the B-29 wasn't. Somebody somewhere decided not to deploy the B-29 to Europe.
Yeah, well, any B-29s.
Well, exactly, not a single one as far as I know. I mean, the first B-29s didn't arrive till after the war, the start of NATO, which was the late 1940s. And also flew in the RAF as well. The RAF had them in the late 1940s. Called them the Washington, but we're that's going off in tangents. But yes, so there's an interesting what if, or why did they persevere the B-17, and arguably why did they persevere the B-17 when the B-24 was a better plane? So the B-24 was a contemporary of the B-17 in the sense of its deployment. So it was used in UK, flew from England to Germany and France and such like. It was used in the Middle East, the Far East, and Burma.
When was the B-24 available then? I must admit.
Well, I couldn't give you the exact time, but the B-17 was more modern, inverted commas, than the B-17. So the B-17 was developed in 1935. The B-24 could fly higher and faster, and it had a bigger bomb load. But whether it was more complicated to build, whether it took longer to build, whether the production lines were up and running, it was deemed to be more vulnerable. There's some shocking pictures. I mean,
looks more like a Lancaster with its double tail.
Yes, and it's got more conventional turret, shall we say, as well.
The Liberator.
Yeah, indeed. We've seen in Masters there some CGI of B-17s being shot down and wings flying off and all the rest of it. Now, there aren't actually many real film shots of B-17s like that. However, if you go to YouTube or Google it, there's lots of B-24s folding up. It was quite vulnerable. If it got hit in the wing, either the engine caught fire and burnt through the wing spars, and the wing would fold up, and that's, nobody's getting out of that. Or flak would hit the wing, and the wing would fold up. So it wouldn't take more than 10 seconds to find some video of a B-24 literally falling to pieces in front of the cameraman's eyes. I'm not saying that didn't happen to B-17s, but it didn't happen anything like as often. So the B-24 was deemed to be a little bit more vulnerable.
They could carry twice as many bombs, so 8,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And they got an extra. There was 11 crew in a B-24.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether there's another gun.
But in the same reason that British tanks weren't as good as they could have been, and British anti-tank guns took ages to be half decent. Once you started building something, it takes a long time to stop building that and build something else. Because obviously, if you stop building A and start building B, there's 9 months in between. You're not building anything.
Well, I think this is probably the biggest what if then, is why didn't they use these? Because they're basically the same type of plane.
They did use them, but the question is, why did they still keep using the B-17 and not the B-24? And maybe our podcast is not an aviation podcast, and it's so it's probably too detailed. But and the end result is the only difference really is more people. Who knows? More crewmen died because the B-24 was probably a better plane, or maybe it was more vulnerable, so maybe less died. But that's that. There is no strategic what if here. There would be no difference to the outcome of the Second World War. No difference to the date of the Second World War. It's just some people would have died in a different way. But it was
obviously designed to provide the same solution as a B-17.
Yeah. Have you got there when it was designed?
1939.
Right, so that's 4 years or 5 years, 4 or 5 years after the B-17. So that's why it's more sophisticated and technologically advanced in terms of its wing. It had a so-called Davis wing, which again we won't get into all that, but that's what gave it a higher ceiling and it was more efficient at altitude. Maybe that's why it made it more susceptible to flak damage as well. The B-17 notoriously or famously was capable of taking ridiculous levels of punishment and still coming back. That probably wasn't quite as true for the B-24, but that wouldn't have been a consideration. I mean, politicians.
Well, according to, I'm just looking at Wiki, so it says mid 43, the shorter range B-17 was phased out.
Well, okay, in favour of
the B-24.
Right, but it was still flying well. It was still flying on the last day of the war, though, wasn't it?
Oh yeah.
So it's that question of you've built them, you're building them. It takes a long time to stop building something and start building something else. And whilst you're doing that, you've lost access to the resource that you're trying to replace. You haven't got any because you haven't started building them yet. Again, in the fantastic American economy of the Second World War, you build as many factories as you need to, but there's only so many trained people to go around building these riveters and designers and all the rest of it. Yes, you can build a factory, but how do you staff it? So again, an interesting what if.
They weren't. It's funny because when you look at the picture, they look old-fashioned to me in comparison to a B-17, which seems to look a bit more modern. But I'm just
you say that, but a version of the B-24, the naval version, it looks a little bit different. The privateer that flew in the American Navy into the early 1960s. The B-17 didn't. Don't be wrong, there were still some B-17s flying around as research beds.
But they did have some issues that it's saying here they leaked fuel, so they had to fly with the bomb bay doors open to let the explosive fumes out, and nobody could smoke on the plane.
Plenty of planes like that. We're going off on massive tangents here, but the F4 Phantom, which certainly in its British version, said if it wasn't leaking, it was empty. But yes, there was plenty of planes like that. But yeah, you're right, not ideal. But again, another interesting what if.
One of the other, so just as another difference between the B-24 and the B-17, so I was trying to find this. So the B-24 can't fly as high as the B-17. So it's only got a ceiling of 25,000 feet.
Yeah.
Whereas the B-17 was closer to 30,000.
Which is an obvious disadvantage because the higher you are, the longer it takes a fighter to get to you, and you might.
Well, and the flak, it's harder
the flak
as
well. But on the other hand, over Northern Europe, how often were B-17s flying at 35,000 feet? Not very often, I suspect, because they wouldn't have been able to see diddly squat on the ground through the cloud. So so there's the on paper trump card, top trumps. I beat you because I can fly higher. Yeah, but the purpose of a bomber is to drop bombs. If you have to fly at 20,000 feet to get below the cloud, or even 15,000 feet to get below the cloud, the fact you can fly at 30,000 feet is a bit moot because there's not many days in Northern Europe which are gin glass clear, no cloud. There might be over the southern states of America where all these planes were developed and tested and the crews were trained. But when you're flying over Northern Europe where it's grey, and even on a sunny day there's always clouds, flying high, yeah, sounds good, but was it a practical benefit? Occasionally it would be, can't dispute that, but most times probably not. So interesting.
No, I'm submitting why I didn't know that much about B-24s. Well, I'm not as knowledgeable as you about.
Well, the classic Navy
some
Liberator.
aspects of
For people of a certain age, children who grew up in the 70s, ships called Liberator were quite famous. But whether you put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4 is always the Blake 7 and all that. For those of us not born in the UK listening to this, what on earth are they talking about? Google it. It's a pretty cool looking spaceship as well, by the way. But we're going off on yet another tangent. But yeah, so. The B7, I suppose the reason that the B17 wasn't replaced within the context of the war, it's because it was there. They were building it. It was understood. It was adaptable. Taking a British design and using it for all sorts of reasons, practical and chauvinistic, which works in both directions, probably wouldn't happen. Replacing it with the B-24, which was a marginally better plane. Yes, they did ultimately try and do that, but there's pros and cons. Replacing it with the B-29, they didn't need to, I suppose, as you pointed out, John. They didn't need to replace it in the UK, in the European theatres, because the B-17 was doing a good enough job. I mean, having said that, if you were somebody on a B-17 getting shot down, you might disagree. But
that's right. I mean, the real answer to the strategy, I suspect, is that having longer range fighter support was, if they could have brought that in it sooner, would have been a better solution than.
Yes. And then ultimately, as it's alluded to in the later episodes of Masters of the Air, the purpose of strategic bombing became not the purpose of the actual bombing. It was bait for the German fighters. The German fighters had to try and stop these bombers, and in doing so, when the P-51s available, made themselves vulnerable. They got shot down in droves. The skill of the pilots, or the skill level of the replacement pilots, because they couldn't train pilots quick, give them enough time. The actual aircraft that were being built, because they were built by slave labourers and all the rest of it, the reliability was...
Yeah, war of attrition, ultimately.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So the B-17s were bait for the ME-109s and FW-190s. The B-51s shot them down in droves, attacked their airfields, gave them air superiority, and it was a self-fulfilling wish. Then the B-17s then could bomb with impunity, which they did. Never. Don't let anybody convince yourself that the American Air Force was bombing only military targets with precision. That was their aim. The reality was the same as the night bombing of the RAF. It was killing people who were sitting in their houses.
And let's not talk about Switzerland. Yeah. So anyway, we've come to the end of our time. I think that was that one rushed by. That one
a slightly different take on the what ifs. No great strategic conversations, but sort of a tactical level series of what ifs. No, it was good. It was good.
Masters, yeah, it's a good program. I'd certainly recommend it.
Indeed. And if you're listening to this in a year and a half's time, thinking, I can vaguely recall that program, I think Masters Air will be one of these Band of Brothers stroke Star Trek TV shows that people will be talking about forever. So this pod, keying into that program, still valid in a year's time.
So thanks everybody for listening, and we shall catch you again on the next podcast. So bye for now.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.